The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house, as Queen Camilla sat at her mahogany desk, carefully reviewing the guest list for the upcoming royal garden party. Her reading glasses perched delicately on her nose as she made small notes in the margins, completely unaware that this would be the last peaceful moment she would have for a very long time. King Charles entered the study with an unusual heaviness in his step. His face bore the weight of a decision that had been troubling him for weeks. The recent scandal involving Camilla's nephew had dominated the headlines for days, and the whispers in Parliament were growing louder. Members of his own family had expressed concerns about the Parker Bowles family's influence on the monarchy. "My dear, we need to discuss something rather urgent," Charles said, his voice carrying a formality that made Camilla look up from her papers with immediate concern. She had known her husband long enough to recognize when something serious was troubling him. The way he stood near the window, avoiding direct eye contact, told her this conversation would not be pleasant. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her pen. "What is it, Charles? You look as though you've seen a ghost," she said, attempting to lighten the mood with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The king moved closer to her desk but remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose he adopted during difficult conversations. "The palace advisors have been in consultation with the Prime Minister's office. There have been concerns raised about certain members of your family and their recent activities." Camilla felt her stomach drop. She knew exactly what he was referring to. Her younger brother Mark's gambling debts had recently become public knowledge, and her sister Annabelle's outspoken political views had caused embarrassment at several high-profile events. Then there was the matter of her nephew's arrest for drunk driving, which had made front-page news across every major newspaper in Britain. "Charles, surely we can weather this storm together. Every royal family faces challenges," she said, rising from her chair and moving toward him. But Charles stepped back slightly, a gesture so subtle yet so devastating that Camilla felt as if she had been physically struck. In all their years together, through all the scandals and controversies they had faced as a couple, he had never distanced himself from her in such a way. "I'm afraid it's more complicated than that, my dear. The advisors believe that the monarchy's reputation is at serious risk. The press is having a field day, and there are calls for investigation into Mark's business dealings. Some are even questioning whether certain family members have been using their royal connections for personal gain." Camilla sank back into her chair, her face pale. She had always known that marrying into the royal family meant intense scrutiny, but she had hoped that after all these years, the public would have accepted her family as they had eventually accepted her. The reality was proving to be far more harsh. "What exactly are you saying, Charles?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. The king finally looked directly at her, and she could see the anguish in his eyes. This decision was clearly causing him pain as well, but his duty to the crown was unwavering. "The advisors are recommending that we create some distance between the royal household and your immediate family members. No more official invitations to state functions, no more use of royal residences for family gatherings, and certainly no more business associations that could be construed as royal endorsements." The words hit Camilla like physical blows. She thought of her grandchildren, who loved visiting the palace gardens. She thought of her sister, who had been planning to host a charity event at one of the royal estates. She thought of all the ways her family had become woven into the fabric of royal life over the past several years. "You're asking me to abandon my family," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm asking you to help me protect the institution we've both sworn to serve," Charles replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "This doesn't mean we stop caring about them or supporting them privately. It simply means we cannot allow their actions to reflect poorly on the crown." Camilla stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Her normally composed demeanor was beginning to crack under the weight of what she was hearing. "And what if I refuse? What if I tell you that my family comes first, as yours should come first for you?" Charles was quiet for a long moment. And in that silence, Camilla could hear the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Each tick seemed to mark another second of their marriage hanging in the balance. "Then I would have to consider what's best for the monarchy," he said finally. And that might mean making even more difficult decisions about the future of our household. The implication was clear, though unspoken. Camilla felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. After decades of fighting for acceptance, after years of building a life together that seemed stable and secure, everything was being threatened by circumstances largely beyond her control. "I need time to think about this," she said, her voice stronger now, though tears were beginning to form in her eyes. "I cannot make such a decision about my own family without careful consideration." "Of course," Charles nodded. "But I must tell you that the palace is preparing a statement for release tomorrow morning. The advisors believe we cannot wait any longer to address the situation publicly." With that, he turned to leave the study, pausing only at the doorway. "I truly am sorry, Camilla. I know this isn't what either of us wanted." After he left, Camilla remained standing in the empty room, surrounded by the trappings of royal life that had once seemed so precious to her. The silk wallpaper, the priceless paintings, the ornate furnishings, all of it suddenly felt like a beautiful prison. She walked to the window and looked out at the gardens where she had spent so many peaceful mornings, wondering if she would ever feel at home in this place again. The tears that had been threatening finally began to fall as she thought about having to explain to her family that they were no longer welcome in her new life. How could she tell her sister that her charity work would no longer have royal patronage? How could she explain to her grandchildren that they wouldn't be able to visit Granny at the palace anymore? As the afternoon wore on, Camilla found herself walking through the halls of Clarence House, looking at family photographs that would soon need to be removed from public view. Each image told a story of joy and connection that was now being systematically erased for the sake of royal protocol. The phone rang several times, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. She knew it would be family members calling about the rumors that were already beginning to circulate in the press. Tomorrow's newspapers would make everything official, and there would be no hiding from the consequences of this decision. That evening, as she sat alone in the drawing room, Camilla realized that she was facing the most difficult choice of her life. On one side was her family, the people who had loved and supported her long before she ever wore a crown. On the other side was her duty as queen, her loyalty to Charles, and her responsibility to an institution that was bigger than any one person. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as she contemplated a decision that would change everything she thought she knew about her role as both a wife and a queen. The next morning arrived with the relentless precision of royal protocol, regardless of Camilla's sleepless night. She had spent the dark hours pacing her private chambers, rehearsing conversations she dreaded having, and imagining the pain she would see in her family members' eyes. The grandfather clock had chimed every hour through the night, each sound a reminder that dawn would bring consequences she could no longer avoid. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, entered with the morning newspapers and tea service, her expression carefully neutral despite the explosive headlines that screamed across every front page. "Royal family distances itself from Parker Bowles scandals," read the Times. The Daily Mail was less diplomatic. "Queen's family banned from palace as king takes action." Camilla's hands shook as she lifted her teacup, the delicate china rattling against the saucer. The articles were filled with quotes from unnamed palace sources, describing the difficult but necessary decision to protect the monarchy's reputation. Her family's private struggles had been dissected and analyzed by journalists who had never met them, their mistakes magnified, and their humanity stripped away. "Ma'am, your sister Lady Annabelle is requesting an urgent meeting," Sarah informed her quietly. "She's quite distressed by the morning coverage." Quote, before Camilla could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the main entrance hall. Even through the thick walls and heavy doors of the royal residence, she could hear her brother Mark demanding to speak with her immediately. The staff were clearly struggling to manage the situation diplomatically. "I'll see them both in the blue drawing room," Camilla decided, knowing that a private family meeting was inevitable. "Please ensure we have complete privacy." 20 minutes later, Camilla faced her siblings in the elegant room where she had hosted countless official receptions. But nothing in her royal training had prepared her for this moment. Mark's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, while Annabelle appeared to have been crying throughout the night. "How could you let this happen?" Mark demanded before she could even speak. "Years of supporting you, defending your relationship with Charles when half the country wanted nothing to do with you. And this is how you repay us? Annabelle was quieter, but her pain was perhaps more devastating. The children are asking why they can't visit Aunt Camilla anymore. My youngest saw the newspaper headlines and asked if we had done something wrong. How do I explain to a 7-year-old that their family is suddenly not good enough for the palace? Camilla felt as though her heart was being torn in 2 directions. She wanted to comfort them, to tell them it was all a mistake that could be fixed. But she also understood the impossible position Charles faced as king. The monarchy's survival depended on public trust, and that trust was fragile. This isn't about not being good enough, she said carefully. It's about protecting an institution that's bigger than any of us. Surely you can understand that my role as queen comes with responsibilities that sometimes conflict with what I want as your sister. Listen to yourself, Mark shot back. You sound exactly like one of those palace handlers who used to dismiss you as unsuitable for Charles. Remember when they said you weren't worthy of being queen? Now you're using their same arguments against your own family. The parallel was painful and accurate. Camilla remembered all too well the years of criticism and rejection she had faced from royal establishment figures who deemed her inappropriate for the future king. The irony of now being the one enforcing such boundaries was not lost on her. The gambling debts will be paid, Mark continued, his voice breaking slightly. The business issues can be resolved. None of this has to be permanent. But you're treating us like we're criminals. Annabelle stood and walked to the window overlooking the gardens where her children had played just weeks earlier. I keep thinking about Mama, she said softly. She was so proud when you married Charles. So happy that you had found love again after all those difficult years. What would she think about us being cast aside like this? Their mother's memory hung heavy in the room. Rosalind Parker Bowles had indeed been proud of Camilla's eventual acceptance by the royal family and the public. She had lived long enough to see her daughter crowned queen, but had passed away before witnessing this family crisis. Mama would want me to do what's right, Camilla replied, though her voice lacked conviction. And abandoning your family is what's right? Mark asked. When did protecting your crown become more important than protecting the people who loved you first? The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock, and Sarah entered with a message that Charles was requesting Camilla's presence in his study immediately. The timing suggested he had been monitoring the family meeting and decided to intervene before it became too heated. We're not finished discussing this, Mark said, as Camilla prepared to leave. Actually, I think we are, she replied, straightening her shoulders in a gesture her family recognized from childhood. It was the same posture she had adopted when making difficult decisions as a young mother. The palace position has been made clear, and I support my husband's decision. But even as she spoke those words, Camilla felt as though she was betraying fundamental parts of herself. Walking away from her siblings felt like walking away from her own history, her own identity beyond the royal titles and protocol. In Charles's study, she found him meeting with the palace communications director and chief of staff. The conversation stopped abruptly when she entered, and she realized they had been discussing how to handle the ongoing family crisis. I trust your meeting with Mark and Annabelle went as well as could be expected, Charles said, his tone formal in front of the staff members. They're hurt and confused, Camilla replied honestly. And I can't say I blame them. The communications director cleared his throat. Ma'am, with respect, we need to maintain a united front on this decision. Any appearance of internal disagreement could worsen the situation. And what about my appearance of humanity? Camilla snapped, her composure finally cracking. Am I supposed to pretend I feel nothing about cutting ties with my own family? Charles dismissed the staff members with a gesture, leaving him alone with his wife. When the door closed, his formal demeanor softened slightly, but the underlying tension remained. This is temporary, he assured her. Once the current crisis passes, we can gradually begin including them in private family events again. And what if the crisis doesn't pass? Camilla asked. What if every mistake they make, every human failing they display, becomes reason to keep them at a distance? At what point does temporary become permanent? Charles was quiet for a moment, and she could see that he was struggling with these same questions. Being king meant making decisions that served the greater good, even when those decisions caused personal pain. "I've been thinking about our coronation," Camilla continued. "Do you remember how happy we were that day? How proud our families were to be part of something so historic? My grandchildren carried my train. My sister sat in the front row. My brother stood guard at the ceremony. They were part of making me queen, and now I'm being asked to pretend they don't matter." "The circumstances have changed," Charles said. But his voice lacked the authority it usually carried. "The circumstances have always been challenging," Camilla countered. "When you chose to marry me, everyone said it would damage the monarchy. When we faced criticism about our relationship, we stood together. When the press attacked us, we weathered it as a team. But now, when my family faces criticism, suddenly solidarity becomes secondary to public relations." The argument that followed was one of the most serious of their marriage. Voices were raised, painful truths were spoken, and accusations flew back and forth about loyalty, duty, and the true cost of royal life. By the end of it, both of them were emotionally drained and no closer to a resolution. That evening, Camilla sat alone in her private sitting room, surrounded by photographs and mementos from decades of family life that suddenly felt like evidence of a different person's existence. Tomorrow would bring more headlines, more scrutiny, and the beginning of a new chapter in her royal life that felt less like a privilege and more like a sacrifice she wasn't sure she was willing to make. The following weeks passed in a blur of public engagements and private anguish. Camilla maintained her royal schedule with the precision expected of a queen, attending charity galas, ribbon cuttings, and state functions while her personal world crumbled around her. The palace staff noticed her increasing withdrawal, the way her smiles seemed forced, and how she often stared out windows during meetings as if searching for escape. The media coverage had intensified rather than diminished. Every day brought new revelations about her family's past indiscretions, some real and others manufactured by tabloids hungry for scandal. Mark's business dealings were scrutinized with forensic detail. Annabelle's political comments were taken out of context, and even distant relatives found themselves thrust into unwanted spotlight. The Parker Bowles name, once synonymous with country gentry and quiet respectability, had become a source of royal embarrassment. Charles had thrown himself into his duties with even greater intensity, as if he could outrun the consequences of his decision through sheer royal obligation. Their conversations had become stilted and formal, limited to necessary communications about schedules and official business. The easy intimacy they had shared for decades seemed to evaporate under the weight of institutional pressure. It was during a particularly difficult state dinner that the breaking point finally arrived. Camilla sat at the head table, mechanically making conversation with visiting dignitaries, while her thoughts drifted to her granddaughter's birthday party that she would not be attending. The little girl had specifically requested that Granny Queen come to see her blow out the candles, not understanding why royal duties now prevented such simple family moments. As the evening wore on, Camilla excused herself from the dinner, claiming a sudden headache. Instead of returning to her chambers, she found herself walking through the palace corridors toward the room where royal portraits hung in chronological order. She stopped before a painting of Queen Mary, known for her strict adherence to royal protocol and her ability to sacrifice personal desires for duty. "Did you ever wonder if the price was too high?" she whispered to the painted figure, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. She continued walking until she reached the palace gardens, where the cool night air provided some relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. It was there that she encountered Thomas, one of the long-serving royal guards, who had known her since her earliest days at the palace. He was completing his evening rounds and seemed surprised to see the queen wandering alone at such a late hour. "Your Majesty, is everything all right?" he asked with genuine concern. For a moment, Camilla considered giving the standard royal response about being perfectly fine, but something in his kind eyes made her honesty surface instead. "Thomas, you've served this family for many years. Have you ever seen duty and family love come into such conflict that choosing between them seemed impossible?" The guard was quiet for a moment, clearly understanding that he was being trusted with something deeply personal. "Ma'am, I've watched royal families face many difficult decisions over the decades, but I've also noticed that the choices made from fear rarely bring lasting peace, while those made from love tend to find a way to honor both duty and heart." His words stayed with her as she finally returned to her chambers. That night, she made a decision that would challenge everything the palace advisors had recommended. She would not abandon her family, but neither would she abandon her role as queen. There had to be a third option that preserved both her integrity and her crown. The next morning, Camilla requested an emergency meeting with Charles, his senior advisors, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. When they assembled in the throne room, she stood before them with a composure that masked months of internal struggle. "I have something to say about the current family situation," she began, her voice clear and determined. "I understand the concerns about protecting the monarchy's reputation, and I share those concerns. However, I cannot and will not participate in a decision that requires me to abandon the people who loved me long before I wore this crown." The chief advisor began to object, but Camilla raised her hand to silence him. "I am not finished. I propose a different approach. Rather than hiding from my family's problems, we will address them directly and transparently. Mark will enter a rehabilitation program for his gambling addiction, and we will be open about his struggle as an example of how families can support each other through difficult times. Annabelle's political views may be controversial, but they are not treasonous. And, in a democracy, family members are entitled to their opinions." Charles was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Camilla, the risks of honesty are less than the risks of hypocrisy," she interrupted. "The public is not stupid, Charles. They know that real families face real problems. What they cannot forgive is the appearance that we consider ourselves above the human struggles they face every day." She turned to address the advisors directly. "You have counseled hiding and distance as protection for the monarchy. I propose vulnerability and authentic response instead. Let the royal family be seen supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning each other at the first sign of trouble." The Archbishop spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "There is wisdom in what Her Majesty suggests. The principles of forgiveness and family loyalty are deeply held values among the people we serve." "And what if this approach fails?" the communications director asked. "What if the public sees this as weakness rather than strength?" Camilla smiled for the first time in weeks. "Then we will have failed while trying to honor both our duty and our humanity. That seems preferable to succeeding by abandoning either one." The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated, but gradually a new approach emerged. Rather than banishment, there would be accountability. Mark would publicly acknowledge his mistakes and seek help, with royal support clearly visible throughout his recovery. Annabelle would continue her charitable work but with clearer boundaries around political expression during royal events. The family would remain connected but with a new understanding of how their actions reflected on the crown. 2 weeks later, Camilla stood before the royal guard for what had been planned as a formal ceremony. Instead, it became something unprecedented. As she addressed the assembled guards about duty and service, her voice broke slightly when she spoke about the importance of protecting not just institutions, but the people who serve them. "I have learned," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes, "that true strength lies not in perfection, but in the courage to face our imperfections with grace and determination. A monarchy that cannot show compassion to its own cannot credibly show compassion to the nation." The tears that fell were not tears of defeat or embarrassment, but tears of relief. For the first time in months, she felt aligned with her values rather than at war with them. The guards, moved by her honesty, responded with an understanding that transcended protocol. In the months that followed, the royal family's new approach faced criticism from some quarters but ultimately strengthened their connection with the public. Mark's journey through rehabilitation became a powerful example of family support overcoming addiction. Annabelle's charitable work expanded within appropriate boundaries. The Parker Bowles family remained part of Camilla's life, but with a mature understanding of their unique responsibilities. Most importantly, Camilla and Charles rediscovered the partnership that had sustained them through decades of challenges. They learned that duty and love need not be enemies, but could be allies in building a monarchy that served both crown and people with authentic humanity. The tears that had fallen that day before the royal guard were remembered not as signs of weakness, but as evidence of a queen who had chosen love over fear, integrity over convenience, and family over the false promise of protection through abandonment. In doing so, she had not diminished the crown, but had shown that even queens could be courageously, imperfectly, beautifully human.